This is To Help You Heal, and I'm your host, Marie Monville. We are going to spend 10 minutes talking about healing. What kind of healing do you need? Is it in your mindset? Is it emotional healing? Is it spiritual healing? You know, there's a lot of healing that we all need, and this is where you're going to find it every week, 10 minutes on Tuesday. I'm so glad you're spending this time with me. I want to talk about what it looks like when it doesn't look like your miracle is happening, because I think for a lot of us, we find ourselves in these places where we're believing for God's intervention, believing for his miracle. And then we see our lives going in a certain way and we're thinking, this can't be the way to my miracle. This doesn't look like what a miracle should look like. And over the past week or so, I've been thinking about that and thinking about the stories that we read of in the Bible where we know that the ending is a miracle. And it's different for us because we're not walking it out. It's not our story. We know going into it that this story is going to result in a miracle. I think of the father that we read about in Mark chapter 9, verses 23 and onward, where he brings his son to Jesus, and his son has had this condition where he has these convulsions. And, so this man is telling Jesus about the fact that his son has thrown himself into the fire and into the water. And that, basically he thinks that one of these days his child's gonna die. And he's there and he's asking Jesus for his miracle. And he says to him, I believe, but help my unbelief. And I think for a lot of us, we probably can identify with his statement. We believe, but yet there's this part of us that doesn't believe because the road that we've walked doesn't look like a road that we would think would lead us to a miracle. But isn't that the way it always goes? I mean, can you think of any story in the Bible where you would start out reading that story and think, this is the makings of a miracle. Watch how this is going to unfold? If we didn't know the ending before we started reading it, in a lot of those places, we wouldn't think that it's going to be something miraculous. I think of Joseph, how his brothers sold him into slavery and his life kind of went from bad to worse in Egypt. And yet he was in this dungeon, in a prison, in this place of not having access to the outside world, being there not because of anything that he did, but all of the false accusations. And yet, when he was a child, he had this dream that his brothers were going to bow down to him. And I would imagine for Joseph, he faced the reality that his life didn't look anything like the makings of that miracle. He was so far separated from them and he was a prisoner, all of the ways that his life was not echoing a miracle. And yet, God did it all. He brought him into this place of being second in command in Egypt, and he ended up being reunited with his family, and they did, in fact, bow down to him. And I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves of those parts of the story where, the reality is that for us, our lives aren't necessarily looking like a miracle either. In fact, we're probably feeling like we're going the complete wrong direction. But isn't that the same thing that Joseph experienced? Isn't that the norm? That sometimes what seems to make sense or not make sense to us is exactly what makes sense to God because he doesn't see it the way we see it. He's not focused on the circumstantial experiences that we are. Instead, he's looking at it through this lens of what he's doing and all that he's planned. And I think he knows that sometimes we go down a really bumpy road and sometimes maybe we hit this place that feels rock bottom. And yet, that's the making of our miracle. And it doesn't mean that, as we're walking it out, that we're even going to have any awareness that it's our miracle or that we're even going to want to go down the path that's set before us. I mean, think about the Israelites as they were leaving Egypt and God parted the Red Sea. It's easy to kind of get caught up in the majestic nature of that moment and think, wow, God drowned the Egyptians in the water and he made this way for them and they walked through on dry ground. And isn't that incredible? Yes, but the reality is that they had these walls of water on either side of them that weren't just still and calm, like a bathtub or a fish tank. It probably was swirling like a tsunami, this wall of raging water that was being held there so they could walk across on dry ground. And I would imagine for most of them, they were thinking, you know what? The reality is this might not work and we might die here, but we're going to die anyway. So we might as well just keep going. And I think, for a lot of us, we can find a place of connection or a similarity in their experiences and what we know, because in our lives and in our world, the places that we are asking God for his intervention, the places where we are asking for a miracle, it might not look like we're living the substance of the miracle that we'd hoped for, but it does not mean that we're not going to get the miracle that God has promised, the miracle that we're believing him for, because he takes the most unlikely of experiences and works them for our good. And he does things in them that we wouldn't have ever seen or that we wouldn't have anticipated. We couldn't have written the story that way if we tried, because he sees it all and he knows what's going to lead us to that place of our miracle. And so, friend, if you are walking a path and you're saying to yourself, this isn't what I wanted, and I felt like God had made this promise to me, but I'm not seeing the reality of that. I want to encourage you that does not mean that you're not walking out your miracle. Because right now, in this hard place where you are, in the season that doesn't make sense, in the circumstances that you didn't want and never would have chosen, that you wouldn't have thought God would have had for you, that can still be the path to your miracle. And I think in those places, in those times when we feel discouraged, or when it's hard, and when we are tired, and when we don't feel like going, we just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And we have to stand in the confidence that he has not forgotten us, that he will never forget us, and that he is still working out our miracle. Because I think the biggest thing that gets in the way, it's us. It's what we think about our circumstances. It's what we believe about what we're going through. It's the discouragement we face. And sometimes we are the one that gets ourselves off track and takes us out of the place of walking that path towards the miracle that God had. And the good news is that he is always ready to welcome us back. So if you find yourself in this place where you're saying, my mindset has gotten the better of me, or my self talk, or my discouragement, or my inability to believe that God is still going to do this thing, it's gotten in the way. I think he's ready and willing and waiting for us to acknowledge that and to have him help us get back on track, because he's not going to give up on us. He's not going to walk away from us. But he is a loving father who is always ready to bring us back, who is excited about the plans that he's walking out in our lives, and who asks us to just trust him a little bit longer. And if there's anything that I know from the experiences of my life, it's that he's trustworthy, that he does do far more than we could ever ask or think or imagine, and that what the enemy means for evil, he will use for good. Those aren't just happy thoughts or great ideas that are written in the Bible, but they're real, and they're statements that are powerful, and they apply to each one of us in all the places where we are waiting for him. And back to that boy and his father, where was his mom in this story? Did she have to stay home because she had other kids and she couldn't go with him on the journey? Was she thinking, as she surrendered her child to her husband and they headed out the door, was she wondering if she was ever going to see him again? Was she wondering if her child would even make it back alive? It was for her this place of surrender of the greatest miracle that she could have hoped for, the life of her child. And so, if you are waiting on the miracle in someone else's life, maybe you find yourself in a similar place with this woman, and all that we can only imagine she faced as she let her husband and her son walk out the door. And for her, it was this place of patience and waiting and hoping, of not being an active participant in his story, but standing by the side back in their home and believing that he was going to come back. And I don't know what her thought process was, but I hope that she was filled with great expectation. And I can only imagine that God was meeting her in her home in the same way that he was meeting her husband and her son face to face with Christ. And the same God who met them there is the same God who meets each one of us. He walks with us down our road to the miracle, down our friend or family member's road to their miracle. And he invites us to come along on this adventure and to watch him in all the places where he's going to open doors and unfold the story in ways that we wouldn't have imagined, because he's good and he knows where he's taking us and we can trust him. And so, if you have felt like this message is for you, I just want to encourage you, you're not the only one. And together we can stand arm in arm with each other, encouraging one another to still believe, to still pursue the Lord, to know that He is good and that He hasn't given up. And so we're not giving up yet either. So take some time just to spend in prayer. Just talk to God. Tell Him where you're at, and then let Him speak to you. Believe that the words that you hear inside your heart and mind are His words of encouragement for you. Believe that even when it doesn't look like the story that you imagined, it still is the path to your miracle. I hope that this episode has encouraged you, and I hope you'll come back next week. Feel free to share this with your friends, but come on back next week as we journey together in these places of healing that God has for us. I'll see you next time.